How did it get to be like this? This is a chart of Congress and voting patterns going all the way from the 1950s to 2011. And you can see that as time goes on, Congress has stopped voting together. Republicans don't vote on Democratic bills and vice versa. Here's another visualization. It almost seems like fission, like two entities separating. You can trace the influx of various cohorts in the House and the Senate through the years. You can see when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office, uh, uh, several left-leaning Democrats came with him. The Republican side, on the other hand, began coalescing in the 70s and 80s. And the far right began to become a bigger and bigger part of Republican politics in the early 90s. You can see this on the House side, and then eventually in the Senate side as well. So while the left and the far left and the far right have become stronger powers in both houses of Congress, or both parties in Congress, the far right has become a bigger percentage of the Republican Party as opposed to the far left, right? So people like Bernie Sanders are still somewhat marginalized in the Democratic Party. People like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the right, Tom Cotton, and Ted Cruz, and a bunch of those people are fairly mainstream within the party. Ezra Klein argues that the cause of this is due to bringing in cultural issues into the political discourse. And he argues that you can actually see this happen in the mid-60s, where the Voting and Civil Rights Act passed, the Democratic coalition realigned, and then the Republican coalition with the Southern Strategy in the late 1960s, and further advanced by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, coalesced the party around three big pillars: anti-communism for foreign policy, free market capitalism for economic policy, and religious right for social policy. Those three arguably wouldn't have had much to do with each other had they not just been coalesced into one party. So the Democratic Party formed its coalition in response to that. Ezra Klein also argues that there's a broader base on the Democratic side because they passed the Civil Rights Act. African Americans vote largely for Democrats, but African Americans are substantially more ideologically diverse than other cohort groups. And so there's an entire coalition that is part of the Democratic Party that prevents them from being as ideologically homogenous as is possible in the Republican Party. I mean, I think there's some deep truth to that analysis. Essentially, it's harder to herd a diverse coalition than to get a a more homogenous coalition, even if they represent the same number of people, and even if they are not homogenous in most respects, right? So like the difference between rural and urban, or the difference between men and women, hadn't become as salient as it started to become. But the American population became a population of mega identities. We used to have these cross-cutting identities where you could identify yourself as um, being a particular age range, or living in Reno, or being of a particular religious or political affiliation. And some of those cut across each other so that you could still find lots of things to identify with um, people from other walks of life. But we've formed these mega identities largely because um, all of these identities have started to coalesce, first in one party and then the other party in response to it. I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, but it is a fact of American politics that we are more polarized now than we've been since the Civil War. How does that apply to climate change? I thought that it would be interesting to look at the presidential elections from right around the time that Jim Hansen testified in front of Congress and in front of the world on global warming. So I thought we'd go every 4 years just to catch up with where the political discourse was. In the 1988 presidential campaign to succeed Ronald Reagan, Mike Dukakis and is it Lloyd Benson faced off against George Bush and Dan Quayle, and both called for an elimination of chlorofluorocarbons. The Bush side approached it through encouraging the industry to find alternatives, whereas Dukakis was more willing to have a government play a role in eliminating some of these. George Bush was interested in safe nuclear power, and described himself as wanting to be an environmental president. Dukakis, on the other hand, wanted to increase energy conservation and efficiency, promote renewable energy, and reduce fossil fuel use, and seek international solutions. Pretty straightforward political disagreements from the time. By 1992, George Bush had done none of the things that he had said he was going to do. And so his environmental policy was essentially 180 degrees. He was argued for drilling in wetlands in the National Wildlife Reserve, strip mining coal and forests, dulling the Clean Air Act, and against the Endangered Species Act. Clinton won the nomination in 1992 of the Democratic Party and selected Al Gore, who was famously an environmentalist and famously a leader in the environmental movement from even before he got into politics. They advocated raising mileage standards to something that we don't have even today, supporting NAFTA, which they thought would help with the environment, banning offshore drilling, and joining international agreements on carbon dioxide to address global warming. There was another candidate that actually outpolled both of them at a certain point in the summer of 1992. That was Ross Perot. He argued for a gas tax on gasoline in order to reduce carbon emissions. And he argued for increasing use of coal, nuclear, and largely he was interested in independence from foreign oil. He did not want the United States to be dependent on foreign supply chains. Clinton won that election, And in 1996, he ran for re-election, arguing for several measures to cut carbon production, for the United States to engage internationally in agreements like the Kyoto Protocol that they agreed to later in that term, arguing to throw corporate polluters in jail and to avoid loss of wetlands. Bob Dole won the Republican nomination. Bob Dole is still alive. I think he might be in his 90s at this point, with Jack Kemp as his running mate. They argued a step back from some earlier positions of even George H.W. Bush, argued that we should actually see if greenhouse gases, if global warming required any action, against encouragement. And again, the Republican line at this time was to encourage businesses, once the science was in, and that the world should act, not simply the United States. After 2 terms of Clinton, Al Gore won his party's nomination against Bill Bradley and selected Joseph Lieberman as his vice president. Lieberman was the most moderate or most conservative Democrat in Congress, and eventually ended up supporting John McCain for president. Lieberman had also gone against Clinton in his impeachment, so Al Gore was trying to place some distance between himself and the Clinton administration. But the platform for the Gore-Lieberman ticket included banning offshore drilling, market-based incentives, so moving away from a Perot-style gas tax, but toward a cap-and-trade solution, which had actually been a fairly conservative climate plan at the time. Argued for a trust fund for the environment, was hoping to have smart growth and affordable and available mass transit in the United States, and just general investment and lack of exploitation of the environment. Bush and Cheney, on the other hand, ran on the Republican side. George W. Bush was George H.W. Bush's son. And they were in favor initially of some federal government role, but largely advocated for a federalist, flexible approach where states took more, had more leeway. They wanted incentives for private land stewardship and conservation, to provide money, but to keep drilling. Dick Cheney was famously an oilman before he got into politics. Bush and Cheney won that election and ran for re-election in 2004 against John Kerry and John Edwards, who were advocating making environmental justice an EPA priority, advocated creating a toxics task force at the EPA, extending the Endangered Species Act, and participating in international climate change strategies. George W. Bush had prevented the agreement that Clinton had signed. To be fair, Congress had to ratify it, and they failed to do so when Clinton was still president. But the Kyoto Protocol went into effect without the United States as a signatory. And when they ran for re-election, some of their initiatives actually did the opposite of what the name suggested. Like the Clear Skies Initiative wanted to weaken caps on greenhouse gases and other air pollution. Nevertheless, they advocated putting money to cleaning up contaminated areas and advocated environmental stewardship as personal responsibility and a public value rather than a governmental action. After 2 terms of George W. Bush, Barack Obama and Joe Biden ran for president against John McCain and Sarah Palin. Both were in favor of a cap-and-trade bill, and they differed mildly on drilling. McCain was in favor of drilling in offshore, but did not favor drilling in environmentally sensitive areas. Barack Obama was in favor of ethanol subsidies, which, to be fair, I think is more of an Iowa specific policy goal. McCain was against it. McCain called for new nuclear power plants, and Obama pushed to invest $150 billion on alternative energy sources. He actually managed to get some of this. The investment in alternative energy sources passed. And there was a cap and trade bill that passed the House of Representatives, but it failed in the Senate. So in 2012, when Barack Obama ran for re-election with Joe Biden, he advocated enacting regulations to double fuel economy by 2025, sponsoring green jobs, continuing efforts to address global warming, which they eventually managed to sign a deal in Paris to do this. But they had opened new areas for gas and oil drilling against. They came out against oil subsidies and for ambitious alternative energy plans. Mitt Romney with Paul Ryan ran on the Republican side. And they argued that it was global warming, not America warming, and it should be advocated with China and India, and not in a way that would hurt the United States economy. He was against regulation. They were against regulation and against cap and trade bills. They did hope to make the United States energy independent, largely relying on fossil fuels. 2016 was an election that many of you probably remember. Hillary Clinton with Tim Kaine argued for more renewable energy, conservation of wildlife, to challenge environmental racism. They were ambivalent on nuclear, against the Yucca Mountain, and unclear on fracking. They did want to go into the Paris Agreement that Obama had negotiated. Donald Trump and Mike Pence, on the other hand, argued that global warming was a hoax. They were against regulation on drilling, in favor of fracking, and were hoping to cancel the Paris Agreement, which, by the way, I think is officially the United States pulls out of it in a week and a half. Well, depending on what happens in the outcome of this particular election, in which Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I forgot to edit that part of the slide, I apologize, are advocating spending several $1 trillion on new investments in what is ostensibly the Green New Deal. Like, they agree to everything in the Green New Deal, but the name. The target that they have set is net zero emissions by 2050 to transition coal workers into clean energy jobs, and developing new technologies to capture carbon. Trump and Pence, on the other hand, have rolled back lots of regulations on drilling in favor of fracking. They've lessened protection on endangered species, expanding it, drilling for oil and gas on federal lands and offshore. But they do want clean air and water. So that's the election that we are facing now. As of this recording, I don't know who's going to win, but you might.